Okay, hi everybody. My name's Margherita. I'm the CEO of the Settlement Council of Australia. Let me start, of course, by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands we are meeting on today, and I pay my deepest respects to elders past and present, and of course extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples that may be joining us. As we discuss disability rights and justice, I also want to acknowledge the leadership of the First Peoples Disability Network. Their work, of course, reminds us that disability justice must be grounded in the truth of this land, in sovereignty, in the impacts of colonisation, and in the strengths of Indigenous worldviews. Their advocacy consistently shows us that you cannot separate disability rights from the ongoing work of truth-telling, equity, and self-determination. For the settlement sector, this is a crucial reminder. Everything we do sits within the broader story of this country, and that story begins with First Nations peoples. As I said, I'm the CEO of the Settlement Council of Australia. Thank you for joining us on this very important conversation on the Disability Discrimination Act, or the DDA, and why it matters so much for multicultural migrant refugee communities. Today's session emerges from the joint submission that we developed with NEDA, or the National Ethnic Disability Alliance, drawing on consultations across our lived experience networks, sector members and experts, including one of our speakers today, the marvellous, the brilliant Margherita Coppolino, a nationally recognised disability and inclusion consultant and lifelong advocate for accessibility, representation and equity. And of course, Marg, if I could sneak in, a good dear friend of mine that I've known now for almost 4 decades. We're getting on. We're also joined, of course, by Brahmmi Kumarasamy, who brings deep expertise in disability rights, racial justice and systemic reform. And Brahmmi, in the short time that I've known you, can I say how incredible your contribution to this area of work has been, and how much SCOA have learned from the leadership that you've shown through the work at NEDA. Both Brahmmi and Margherita have been instrumental in shaping our submission, our joint submission, and in guiding us towards a stronger, more inclusive disability rights framework. Iga and I at the Settlement Council of Australia and the team have been talking for quite a while now about why. Why does this matter for the settlement sector? Because as I said earlier, disability is a human right, not an add-on. And rights are indivisible, meaning we can't advance this group of migrant and refugee rights and justice without advancing disability justice. The experiences of migrants and refugees with disability sit at the intersections of multiple systems, multiple vulnerabilities and multiple forms of exclusion. And yet their rights under the DDA are often the least understood and sadly still remain the least accessed. So our joint submission really tried to highlight these points. Awareness of the DDA is low. Misconceptions remain high, and far too many people believe that they're not entitled to protections, especially temporary visa holders, refugees, newly arrived migrants. So that's why we're here today, to explain the DDA, to demystify the protections that it provides, and importantly, to empower our communities and our organisations to be able to use it effectively in the way that it was intended to be used. So with that, I'm going to hand over to the marvellous Iga, who will guide us through the foundations of the DDA, why it's being reviewed right now, and what every member of our sector needs to know. Iga, over to you.
Thank you, Maria. So my name is Iga. I'm the Policy and Programs Coordinator at SCOA, and in the last couple of months, we've worked with NEDA to submit a submission to the review of DDA. And as part of that process, we led consultations with our members and networks. And one of the key things that we learned through that process, I think, was that there's very low awareness of the DDA, or like not a lot of people are actually familiar with what it is, let alone how to use it. So we wanted to record like a short video to introduce the DDA and just give a brief like overview of how to use it, what is it for, why it's being reviewed. So I think let's start with the basics. A question to either of you, Margherita or Brahmmi: what is the DDA, and why is it being reviewed now?
It's Australia's anti-discrimination law that protects marginalised people from discrimination. And it's been, 1992? So it's been some time. So it's definitely time for a review. Since then, frameworks like intersectionality have gained traction.
Yeah, a lot has changed since the last time the DDA was reviewed, obviously. So, and maybe a question to Margherita now. For people who may not be familiar with the DDA, like how broad the protections are, and can you explain like which disabilities and which groups are included in the Act?
Yeah, look, that's a great question. You know, given that the Commonwealth Disability Discrimination Act was that's dated in 1992, and in fact, we were the second country to actually introduce a Disability Discrimination Act. Before us was America. Interesting enough, the Australian Disability Discrimination Act was pretty much based similar to what the Americans did around the American Act. Some of the things that we did differently from the Americans was that the introduction of voluntary disability action plans. But also, given the time it was written and legislated, 1992, the word around intersectionality and, you know, the CRPD, the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disability, where it was doing its work, you know, that recently celebrated 10 years. So it was pre all that. So there were a lot of gaps in the current Commonwealth DDA that really misses the opportunity to include all intersectional lands. And last but not least, I think the thing that I particularly want to raise is the Immigration Act in Australia is actually exempt under the Disability Discrimination Act, because, you know, the state parties being the countries, argue that it would be seen if we take people with disabilities to a migrant, it would be seen as a burden on the Australian government.
Yeah, I think that was one of the recommendations we gave in the DDA, to remove the exemption. But yeah, also I think one of the common misconceptions is that the DDA doesn't like include people who are not citizens in Australia or on temporary visas, which obviously isn't true. So could you give us maybe like any practical examples of what disability discrimination might look like under the DDA?
An example of how it may protect someone under the DDA. Once it's renewed, we hope that people don't have to prove as hard that it's their disability that led to discrimination. It can be a combination of factors. So that's one of the ways in which the protections we hope will be strengthened. Other protections include out in the community, shopping centres, public places, where currently, again, a lot of the burden of proof falls on the person facing the discrimination, but I think the amendments will make it so that that work is shared across all parties, including the Australian community as a whole.
Yeah, Margherita, do you have anything to add?
Excuse me, my hay fever is going all over the place. So I think the thing to highlight, as we've both already covered other areas, the term around direct discrimination and indirect discrimination is quite different. It needs to be strengthened. So direct discrimination is, let's say somebody says, I'm not going to employ you because you've got a disability. That's direct discrimination. Where it's indirect discrimination, oh, well, look, I'll employ you. Let's say I have a service dog or something, but I'm concerned about the fact that you have used mobility aids. So that is a way of kind of indirect, because it's not directed at me, it is indirected at tools that I use to be independent. Also, as I mentioned earlier about the Disability Discrimination Action Plans, the 4 key areas they talk about for organisations to do that: it's goods and services, employment and recruitment, communications. So when organisations develop disability action plans, they don't think about intersectionality, they only think about the mainstream disability types. So there's that, and also that some of the items, mobility items that people use, people say, oh, but they're not covered, like service dogs are not covered. And that needs to be brought in, because more and more people are using therapy dogs, service dogs, etc., etc. So it also, if I can use quickly a particular scenario that I often talk about, a person with a disability who is transitioning their gender, who also comes from a culturally diverse background, is actually working in a supported employment program. They were bullied by another person with a disability. So people ask, what kind of discrimination is that? Technically, that particular person actually was discriminated based on their sexuality, not bullied because of their disability by a co-worker. That same person from a culturally diverse background who's transitioning goes out to the community, and their cultural community gets bullied based on their sexuality by their own ethnic community. So when you start to unpack it from that perspective, compounding issues for people with disabilities tend not to be quite prescriptive in their Disability Discrimination Act.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's like one of the things in the DDA was like increased recognition of intersectionality in the review, but also I was just thinking, like, through the consultations that we held, something that you mentioned earlier, Margherita, a lot of the times we were told that people, especially from migrant and refugee backgrounds, were very hesitant to report discrimination when it happened for so many different reasons. Like, for example, one of them was disclosing disability and how would that impact their future visas, or in like at work, disclosing their disabilities or asking for accommodations when people, especially on certain types of visas, are so like relying on their employment to like keep their visa or get the next visa. So it can be a bit of a struggle. But then in terms of like, what does it look like if someone wanted to report discrimination? Where can they go? What are some practical steps they can take? For example, can they go to the Human Rights Commission? Are there any other avenues where they can report discrimination?
Hopefully it becomes easier after this review and less burdensome on the person facing discrimination, because I do think it is quite a burdensome, resource-intensive process currently, and which makes it very difficult or close to impossible for certain people to report discrimination. And yeah, it can feed into like a cycle of helplessness as well. Like even when there are when we have the means, it can still be difficult for someone who has a history of trauma to then report that. So hopefully the new changes help untangle that a little bit. I think it's important to write down what has happened, keep a record as things happened, including your own notes as well as any emails or messages, or if it's the school system refusing accommodations for your child, then any like traces of emails and communications with that, potentially a supporting letter from your health practitioners, asking others to help with translation if needed, that kind of support. There's also community services that can help in reporting discrimination, such as legal aid, so free legal aid organizations, individual disability advocacy organizations, unions, if it's an issue with one's employer, like union, Fair Work. Basically a multitude of ways to report, which would still fall under the disability violation of the Disability Discrimination Act, depending on if it's a workplace issue or a school issue.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's also important to mention that like most of the services are confidential, and like they're not really allowed to like disclose your information, if that's one of the concerns. Was there anything else that either of you wanted to add?
Yeah, look, I think it's important to also mention that under the current DDA Act 1992, the onus is really on the person with a disability to prove that they were discriminated against.
Yeah.
So it's really, and I know that got discussed in quite a few of the focus groups that people were talking about on the review. So that's something that needs to be looked at. But the question was, where are the avenues for people to complain? So here in Victoria, we have the Office of Public Advocate. So that's one area. Also, the community legal services that are funded by the federal government. Disability legal services are a good avenue to go and get support to either, think about, do you go through your states and jurisdiction? Because sometimes that's where would be the best avenue, like here in Victoria. Sometimes I've actually put a complaint into the Victorian Equal Opportunity Commission instead of going to the Australian Human Rights Commission, because I know the process here is quicker, and I know I'm protected under the state's jurisdictions more so than federal. The other thing is, when do you use the CRPD articles, as in the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities? Now, the state parties, which is mentioned earlier, are the countries, gets reviewed by the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities Committee every, I think it's 3 to 4 years, and they do a review. But before they do a review, there's a call by NGOs, non-for-profit organisations, to put up recommendations for the CRPD committee to review. So, and then what happens is the CRPD comes here and reviews the Australian government on those recommendations. Now, there's another thing that it would be really good to mention that next year, Australian government will be reviewed under the UN Human Rights Treaty. So earlier this year, excuse me, a lot of the NGOs worked together, and there was a whole piece on disability and intersectionality, and there were lots of recommendations in that for the UN Human Rights Council to look at when they come to Australia early next year. One of them I can specifically remember was to look at detention centres and why LGBTIQ people with disabilities are not getting the services they need while they're in those centres. Now, I'm raising that because it's quite applicable to settlement organisations.
Thank you, Margherita. That's very comprehensive. And there's so much work that needs to be done in that space. And I think, as I said at the session at our conference a couple of weeks ago, I feel like disability is this thing that is kind of like separate from everything else, and like we don't really prioritize it as we should. So there's definitely a lot more work that needs to be done. Yeah, thank you both so much for participating and for all your insights. Maria, did you want to add anything?
Aniga, thank you to you, of course, for fielding those questions. And no doubt after today, there might be many, many more once we share the video. But thank you, Margherita and Brahmmi, because I think it's that, you know, day-to-day engagement that you both have that gives us that insight, because of course you can sometimes pick up a document that tries to explain the DDA, but it's the application of it. So thank you for really bringing it to life. And I think when we do get at the Settlement Council of Australia questions about disability from our member organisations, it's important to say that we do need to build that workforce capacity. So as we move forward and recognise the importance of integrating these sorts of issues as part of our collective responsibility and as something that's very relevant to the settlement sector, that we work closely with organisations like NEDA, Margherita, the work that you're doing, and that we keep pushing for those reforms as we engage in conversations around DDA and legislative change. Our next step will be, of course, to try and build some sector-wide resources together in partnership with NEDA, but particularly amplify the lived experience of people with disability. And we need to recognise that that guidance that is so important to casework, to our practice, to our long-term strategic change, that must be at the heart of our work. So I want to encourage everybody out there who's watching this video to reach out, take the conversations back to your teams, take the conversation back to your organisations, and really emphasise that awareness might be, for some of us in the sector, the first step, but that we have to keep working on ensuring that really this is integrated as core business. So on behalf of SCOA, thank you to both of you, and to Iga, of course. Thank you to the sector, because I know there is a lot of good work that some of our member organisations are doing to ensure that the rights and dignity of people with disability are upheld. We look forward to this conversation, because these are not things that require a tick the box. They are things that really do insist on an ongoing investment by all of us. As I say, Marg, I think if there's one line that you've always taught me, even 40 years ago, is nothing about us without us. And I think that's an important way to end today's conversation. Go well. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much.